I'd like to thank you very much for having me, Lisa, and I'm very glad to be here, and I hope you can all stay because there's free food. So my presentation today is in two parts. I'm going to give a classic PowerPoint-based presentation on mapping and measuring ecosystem services. It's called an institutional analysis, but I will be using data visualization as a way of looking into the black box of this particular regime complex. But I will start with the PowerPoint and then move into the presentation using web-based display materials. So if you have laptops with you, you're welcome to bring them out. You can use your laptop the whole time because I won't tell you off because I'll know that you're doing your own research into my data visualization. So I might walk around a bit, but I'm basically going to drive the show from over here. So if you can't hear me, just put your hand up and I'll speak louder. Yeah, okay, so I'm with the Institute for Ethics, Governance and Law. So I'm more, as I say, of a political animal than an environmental animal, but I do have a background in environmental activism and I've been active in the private sector and I also have been involved particularly in forest issues and especially in forest certification and I was responsible for the introduction of the Forest Stewardship Council certification system into Australia in the early 2000s. And I also sat on the technical reference committee for the Pan-European Forest Certification Scheme as it was introduced into Australia, called the Australian Forestry Standard. So in some ways I'm a classic child of Rio, a believer in the idea of sustainable forest management, but of course sustainable forest management is a concept and a goal that we are always trying to reach, but we never achieve. But I do have a background also in forest management as well as forest conservation. But I went into becoming a researcher after 20 years as an NGO and a private sector environmental consultant. So essentially I'm going to be conceptually speaking largely to the content in this book. I'm expecting a degree of expertise here that I don't have to explain certain concepts. But if you want to get a good understanding of the political economy of sustainable development as a whole, I do recommend this book. This review, so I have one of the co-authors here, Lauren, would you put your hand up? So Lauren is visiting us today along with another ex-colleague of mine from Griffith University, Peter Hall. He's helped me with my design work and Lauren is from the State University of New York and like me, she follows a lot of the international policy processes. But this book is still getting nice reviews, which is always good. This one came out in April. But the reason why I'm highlighting this book is because I have over my life as an academic and an activist and what I like to call now a pracademic, spent a lot of time following intergovernmental policy processes. And looking at their governance quality, particularly emissions trading schemes around the clean development mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol, and as Lisa said, with REDD+, which I'm sure some of you know about. But I've also, as I've indicated, critically interrogated both FSC and PEFC, and also FLEGT as well, which of course, as Europeans would be aware, this is about forest law, enforcement, governance and trade. And being in the EU, you would be aware that your region does tend to pay a certain amount of consideration to issues of sustainability when it comes to trade, which is a good thing. I'd like it to be stronger here in Europe, but you are the leaders of the pack when it comes to looking at sustainability and its relationship to legality and trade. So thumbs up to the EU. I like it as a polity. But I've also looked at payments for ecosystem services and biodiversity offsets as well in my work. And one of the other things that I do, because I have a background as a forestry person, and I'm a great believer in the idea of sustainable forest management, one of the really good things about the Rio Earth Summit is that it came up with this idea that we need criteria and we need indicators to be able to determine the sustainability of different aspects of Agenda 21. So, for example, we have the idea of sustainable development as a broad concept. But then, for example, in forestry, we have the idea of sustainable forest management. But how can we determine the sustainability of forest management? We have developed principles, criteria, and indicators for determining sustainability. And as a governance scholar, what I've done is take the idea of principles, criteria, and indicators, not to look at the quality of forest management on the ground, but to actually look at the quality of governance behind the institutions that implement these different kinds of natural resource management. So this is just a slide full of numbers that probably doesn't have any meaning really to any of us here, but what I just want to emphasize is I use 11 indicators for determining governance quality. So I have 3 indicators that determine the degree of interests that are represented at particular policy initiatives, in terms of how inclusive those initiatives are, the level of equality in terms of the relationships between the different actors, the resources or capacity that they have to be able to represent their interests. I look at issues of responsibility around accountability and transparency. We also explore the quality of decision making around whether the processes have a degree of democracy within them, whether there are methods for reaching agreement, are there methods for settling disputes, and then when it comes to having made the decisions, in terms of implementation, have those decisions changed behaviour around the particular issue area that we're looking at? Have they solved the problem that the policy initiative is seeking to address? And is that problem solution durable or durability? So I have 11 indicators of governance quality that stack back to criteria relating to implementation, decision making, organisational responsibility and interest representation. And they stack back to 2 principles. Is the participation meaningful within that particular policy initiative overall for all the stakeholders? And is the deliberation, is the dialogue and discussion and decision making that occurs productive? If we look at a range of these international policy processes, particularly in the field of natural resource management, we'll see that they have one big strength and one weakness. largely speaking, in the international policy arena, a lot of the sustainable development initiatives, in terms of the research that we have done with working with stakeholders, got a very good score in terms of participants' attitudes regarding their inclusiveness. So I don't know if any of you ever managed to get to the UN climate conferences here in your wonderful city of Bonn. But once you get inside, if you can get inside, you are generally quite well looked after within that policy process. They are quite inclusive on a certain level. And this is also particularly true of, say, the Forest Stewardship Council, for example, as a private sector governance initiative. It has a very nice structure with 3 chambers that represent economic, environmental and social interests. So you do get a feeling of being an insider inside these processes. But when it comes to actually being provided with the resources to adequately represent the interests of your sector, the ability of all of these public or private governance systems to help build capacity and meet the needs of the participants according to the participants themselves is extremely low. So on the one hand, the stakeholders that are participating within these intergovernmental or international private sector policy processes, they feel included, but the actual amount of resources that they are provided to represent the interests that they have come to these processes for are very low. I'll give you a couple of examples. If you are in the United States and you go to, for example, COP21 in Paris, probably the most significant of the climate conferences in recent years because it's created the Paris Agreement, there were over 300 delegates in the UN delegation that year. 250 of them were lawyers, which is why the Paris Agreement is so watertight when it comes to being able to find its way through all the different legal nightmares of trying to represent a range of legal systems and interests. Inclusive. But if you are Tuvalu, who is one of the most climate compromised territory on Earth, you have one person who has to cover the same number of meetings as those 300 Americans. So that country simply does not have the capacity to represent its interests effectively. And this is a problem that we find across the international public and private sector policy processes that we've been looking at. And then there are just a few outliers of interest. For example, in the Clean Development Mechanism, it is not seen as being particularly inclusive, for example. Other mechanisms, interestingly, like FLEGT, the Forest Law Enforcement, Governance and Trade, and Payments for Ecosystem Services as a broader kind of policy concept, score very well in the terms of the participants of these processes around a belief that these will actually change behaviour. So that's quite an interesting observation, I think, for FLEGT, because some of us are a little cynical about it, but some of the participants themselves feel quite optimistic about this. But if we look at a comparison of governance quality in terms of the highest scoring and the lowest scoring, it's interesting to see that the poor old Clean Development Mechanism, which is, if you like, an old generation policy instrument, a kind of historical legacy from the Kyoto Protocol era of 25 years ago, does not score very well in terms of stakeholder perceptions. It only gets a little bit under 30 out of 55. But one of the highest scoring is actually payments for ecosystem services. So those are the kind of two ends of the spectrum. And I won't say much more except have a look at the book and have a read. It's also quite a useful teaching text for students, or also to give yourself a kind of broad general introduction into the political economy of sustainable development. So I just want to now focus on what I'm working on at the moment and the kind of rest of the presentation. So I'm going to talk about the project ValNat, or Valuing Nature. You can go onto the website and it's valueofnature.com, I think, or Valuing Nature. I think it's valueofnature.com. If there's someone there with a laptop, if you can just tell me which one you get up. I think it's valueofnature.com. And that's the project, essentially, that provided the funds for me to do this data visualization work. So I'm focusing particularly on work package 2.1, which was mapping the global governance field of ecosystem services. And I'll talk a little bit about the approach we adopted, the methods we used, and the results. Then I'll give you a demo of the eco-regime map, and hopefully we'll have a bit of discussion if I just don't keep talking so much. Oh, there it is. So it was one of those nice 700,000 or 800,000 euro research projects that we all love to get. And it was also funded by a few notable entities, particularly the Wellcome Trust. I think, haven't you had a project with the Wellcome Trust, Pete?
Not yet.
Not yet. So, I mean, this is one of the holy grails. But we have a naughty actor here. So this naughty actor did bad stuff with its catalytic converters and its emissions data a few years ago. And suddenly we tended not to talk so much about having been sponsored by Volkswagen. But it was an interesting, like I'm now in the last 2 or 3 months of this project. It was a great project. It had a really good title, and I know that sounds facile, but a good title that can really capture what you're trying to say will have a big impact on the funder. And we really wanted to investigate ecosystem services. And we wanted to look at the extent to which ecosystem services had really contributed to valuing nature for sustainable development and the so-called green economy. So we have a 4-year project. Stage 1 was really looking at the story of ecosystem services, how this approach to natural capital and the idea that we can put a price on nature's values, and therefore by marketising it conceptually as having an economic value, we can protect it. And this is really a long story. This is a story that starts, as early as the late 40s with some of the Economic Council work actually within the Bretton Woods institutions and some of the early post-war activities of economists in the US and advising the US administration. And we've got a paper coming out shortly, Debating Nature's Value, Epistemic Strategy and Struggle in the Story of Ecosystem Services. In stage 2, which is what I'm largely talking about today in the mapping process, we've already got one paper coming out. Stuck in capacity building, the unfulfilled promise of ecosystem services. And a second that we're working on at the moment, the rise and fall of ecosystem services, question mark. And then some visualising data in an age of institutional complexity, which is more in the field of my colleagues over here, where we're looking at design and more sociological conceptual issues around how do we represent complex data in this computer age. Stage 3 was about collecting a series of national case studies: Indonesia, India, the UK, Canada and Argentina, and we're looking at the uptake of the ideas around ecosystem services and their evolution in particular countries. And then stage 4, because we always have to report, we're doing synthesis and evaluation, and we're kind of at that stage now. So what we are hoping to find with our investigation into ecosystem services as a policy concept is the extent to which they've really been taken up within the environmental policy sphere. Is it all just motherhood statements, or has it actually had some kind of policy traction? Have they made a difference in how policy is designed and delivered? And have the experiences with the idea of natural capital and valuing nature actually informed contemporary initiatives? And has there been a degree of critical reflection about what was right and wrong with this idea? And are there particular ways of understanding ecosystem services and policy mechanisms that have been more successfully translated into the policy arena? Why is natural capital still being talked about when we have ecosystem services as another discourse, and now increasingly nature's contributions to people, which is the new evolution? You know, why have we got these concepts still battling it out within the kind of policy arena? And which ones have been successful in gaining that interest in policymakers, and which ones have not? And so are there, what are the gaps, what are the breakages within the policy and practice in terms of the way policymakers understand and use these concepts? And are there some factors around context that have made the adoption, for example, of a very economistic way of looking at ecosystem services more suitable than a more ecologistic adoption? And are we looking at a concept that is essentially fundamentally neoliberal, pro single bottom line, profit maximising, capital creation, or is it really a good way of trying to build a triple bottom line global economy? And can we actually adjust this concept to make it more fit for purpose as we go forward into this era of increasing environmental risk and danger? Just quickly, what do we mean by governance when it comes to looking at who's who in the world of international global environmental governance, particularly for ecosystem services? And just because we are mapping the global governance field, it's always good to have some kind of understanding of what we mean by governance, because governance is one of those very slippery concepts that can mean many things to many people. So we've used a very simple and straightforward definition. where we refer to governance as a value-neutral term, referring to the structures and processes used to steer and coordinate interactions within an institution or institutional complex. So, governance, Governanza, cybernetics, Steuerung, the idea behind the word itself is really about steering and coordination of interactions between different stakeholders. It becomes good governance or bad governance when we have different actors exerting more or less power or pushing or steering the institution in one direction or another. Are we right for space?
Yeah, I was just checking if there's another seat there.
And then just in terms of, and I'd refer you to this article. Again, my name's there, but it's really my colleagues, because I just get people to write papers with me and then I don't have to do any work, but I still get my name up there. And what is a field? Well, according to Merriam-Webster, it's an area or division of an activity, subject or profession, and in our case we've really focused on the activities around ecosystem services. So the map that I'm going to be showing you covers the global political economy of the ecosystem services concept, largely before and after 1992. Now here comes the question to the audience, warning, audience participation, what happened in 1992? Don't say my son was born. The Rio Conference. That's it, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, in which sustainable development, as defined in the Brundtland Report a few years earlier in 1987 or whatever, something like that, starts becoming an actual policy initiative, looking at climate, biodiversity, desertification, and unsuccessfully, interestingly, forests. So really, the pivotal year for looking at the evolution of this concept is 1992 and the Rio Earth Summit. So we created a database underneath the visualisation using an existing approach with the climate regime map, which I will show you first before we look at the eco-regime map. But particularly with ecosystem services, we wanted to look at who is using the concept. For example, the Global Environment Facility or the United Nations Environment Programme. How it's being used. Are we looking at a payment for ecosystem services scheme? Are we looking at standard setting? Or is it a valuation exercise or just some kind of generic capacity building exercise? When it was taken up, and we have a series of time instances that we're also looking at. We've also incorporated landmark documents, meetings and milestones associated with each actor. And we're also looking at the year in which actions were agreed or institutions were created and ended as well. And whether a particular country or set of countries has pushed or financed the action more. That's something my other colleagues are doing. So a couple of the questions we were trying to determine was whether ecosystem services can be understood in classic international relations theory as a regime, or is it a regime complex? Can we see it as a policy network, a policy community, or just some kind of general field in the sustainability arena? I don't think we're quite sure yet, to be honest. But I use the term eco-regime because it's just a nice buzzword. It's a lot shorter than any of the others. But we've also used analysis to identify which international and transnational actors are using the concept of ecosystem services, and whether and how the use of the concept has changed over time. Now, there are always many ways to slice into a pie to understand what its ingredients are. And as the research evolved, I started to see the idea of what's referred to as actor network theory as a useful mode of entry for trying to come to grips with ecosystem services as a governance field. In the sense that its kind of approach, as I like to call it, helps you look under the bonnet of a car, for example, in the sense that it allows you to look at or map relations that are both material between things like institutions and are also semiotic or symbolise something else, so different concepts. Hence we might see, surprise, surprise, the Natural Capital Coalition focusing on natural capital, but we might see another institution that is trying to push a different agenda using a different term. Actor network theory also helps us to a certain extent look at human development as being socially situated, and that the way we construct understanding of particular knowledge is through interaction with others. It can be through different networks, but it can also be institutional and person to person, or even a document to a person, or a set of documents to a policy community. So the idea behind the human and the non-human is a little more blurred, we might say. And the other thing is that the empirical analysis, the evidence-based approach that we take when it comes to understanding this very complex governance field is that it's more about describing rather than explaining the social activity that's going on. When I wear my political scientist hat, I love to explain things because I think I have the answer. But sometimes when we look at complex social political interactions, you know, the answer is there are multiple answers and multiple actions. And what becomes more interesting is why is this group over here doing this, and understanding this concept in this way, and why are these people doing it over here in a different way? And what does that look like? When you do research, I don't know about you lot, but you kind of stumble into this project that you say, oh, this is quite interesting, I want to do this research, and you know, you get the money, and then you find this seminal text that you didn't know existed before, and it like really helps you ground your thinking. And I particularly like this guy called Andrew Barry, and he's written this article called The Translation Zone Between Actor Network Theory and International Relations, and it just for me really seems to capture some of the problems I was having as a kind of international relations person who's not really in international relations and isn't really a sociologist and isn't really a political scientist, somewhere in the mix. Because Barry argues a whole series of, or makes a whole series of assertions about actor network theory and international relations. And he suggests that actor network theory cannot simply be applied to international relations, but has to be adjusted and reconfigured in response to the problems that the field itself poses. So, as as I'm sure many of us understand, you just cannot land a particular theoretical approach onto an area of study like an alien spaceship. You have to adjust your approach to understand what's going on, and you need to be informed by the context as well. And he also argues that the actor network theorist needs to be concerned not just looking at international political institutions and the discourses, but actually looking at the study of political expertise and practice itself. So what the actors are doing within there, and also what you as a researcher or investigator yourself are bringing into this analysis as well. And then he makes, for me, this critical observation that in the field of international relations, the question of the relation between what is visible to observers and what is beneath the surface cannot be avoided. You're probably sitting here going, what the bloody hell does that mean? Well, we tend to lump all intergovernmental organisations into one basket. We call them intergovernmental organisations, and they can be the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And because they're intergovernmental, that's what they are. But if we don't look under the bonnet, we don't actually see that these so apparently monolithic institutions are not monolithic at all. They are comprised of multiple actors with multiple agendas, functioning at different levels, all trying to either influence or allow themselves to be influenced by different actors and different factors. And if we just take a classic international relations approach and dismiss all these institutions as intergovernmental, we actually learn very little about them. We may be able to see what they do one to another, but it's a very one-dimensional way of looking at the complexity that lies underneath. And then we have a challenge to those of us who are involved in international politics, however we understand it. I mean, I'm involved in international politics, but I am a Ringo. I'm not a bingo, and I'm not an Engo. I'm a research institution, a non-governmental organisation. I'm not a business international non-governmental organisation, and I'm not an environmental non-governmental organisation. So I'm a researcher of international politics. I'm not a player in the same way that a business person is, but I'm still a player. And we need to understand our own actions or look at the actions of others in a historical context. I was an NGO, an environmental NGO for many years. And if there are environmental NGOs or any other NGOs in here, mon chapeau, as they say in French, I take my hat off to you. But very often, surprisingly, despite having quite a strong, active critique of the policy process that these people are involved in, they tend to only function on the crisis level and from moment to moment. And I am always very surprised with some of my environmental NGO colleagues that they never actually look at the historical context of where they've come from and where they're going to, because, oh my God, the trees are being cut down now. But of course, the trees are only being cut down now because of a decision that was made many years before, and because of the creation of markets that will continue many years into the future, and therefore that's why the tree has to be cut down now. So I liked those kind of warnings about just simply applying actor network theory to international relations and the other way round. All right. So when it came to the actual process of mapping, we had some categorical dimensions. So in terms of activity, where are these activities happening? So we looked at what we call thematic areas of activity in the ecosystem universe. So these were like venues, I could say venues of power or nodes of activity. We looked at different actors, so who is involved, what type of actor are they in terms of the people and the organisations, and in terms of their actions, how they were using this concept. For example, what ecosystem services related actions were they pursuing, particularly around ideas of valuation. So, of course, because, you know, we're academics and we can't do anything without a series of definitions, and then once we've created our definitions, we become rigidly structured by them, because if we don't, there's chaos. So we then went through a series of looking at the universe of ecosystem services in a very different way, for example, than a classic policy regime like the UNFCCC. So we decided to break this universe down into 4 levels, and I use the term levels very loosely. More thematic areas of activity in terms of the agreements that lie behind ecosystem services, particularly the informal and informal institutions, the conventions, the protocols, you know, the kind of CBD, you know, IPBES, all those kind of things. We then looked at the material resources, or the financial and other forms of support for generating knowledge associated with the implementation of those agreements. We looked at the actual knowledge products themselves, because of course if you have an agreement and you then provide finance, which is the way it works or doesn't work in the intergovernmental realm, you then actually have to go out and do your research or your knowledge generation. And then once you've generated your knowledge, you then need to put it into practice. So we then looked at the initiatives globally and regionally. We didn't really look nationally, because in terms of specific projects there are thousands of them, so we had to kind of constrain the research. Where we found activities that were occurring in different countries simultaneously as part of a funded initiative, they went into the map, but that's generally where we stopped. So we then said, okay, well, these are the general areas, thematic areas of activity. So these actors are either involved in agreements, providing material resources, or they're generating knowledge, or they're actual initiatives on the ground. But who are they? So we then broke down the stakeholders, you might call them, into a range of entities, partnerships, intergovernmental organisations, development banks, civil society, business, science, philanthropy and donor. I could go on about why, but I'll be here all day if we do. And then we looked at the action types, what was actually going on. So we've got the thematic areas of activity, we've got the different actors, and then what are they actually doing in terms of ecosystem services. So in terms of the research, we found, generally speaking, that ecosystem service action types were around quite largely valuation, biophysical valuation, economic valuation, what we called integrated valuation that takes social and economic considerations into account in the valuation, looking at capacity building for this concept, rule making around this concept as distinct from agreements, because once you constitutionalise or institutionalise yourself in some way, very often you then have to create rules and standards. Then a few other specific schemes. So we looked at payment schemes, because we have talked about putting a value on nature, and that can mean that you buy and sell or pay for it. And then there are a few quirks or unusual activities within this field, such as offset schemes. And I won't go into detail about offsets, because I'm assuming you are an educated audience, and if you're not, read my book. And then the general policy concept, because when you're talking about international relations, there's always just general policy stuff. Okay, so then going to the methods. Well, what we did was we looked in the internet, and we looked for websites of organisations that have been involved in ecosystem services in the past or the present, through their involvement in partnerships or with major processes, through multilateral agreements or landmark publications like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and how they turned up when we did our search. And we used variations of two key concepts. Interestingly, I saw a few heads nodding earlier when I talked about nature's contributions to people. This term, bang, came up in ITBUS 4. I don't know if any of you were there. It was in Bonn. I think Lauren and I both were. We watched an attempted discursive coup where a particular school of knowledge really pushed to get this concept through. And it was interesting to observe this happening in real time, but we said, no, we're sticking at this point to ecosystem services and natural capital as concepts. And we looked at where these specific words were used together, where the concepts were used in the same paragraph to convey these concepts, and finally where either of these terms or concepts were used in conjunction with the concept of valuation or variance thereof, including values, evaluation or assessment. And then we used, importantly for researchers, warning, 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 don't use Google, because it will tell you who's been monetised, who's been commercialised, who's been industrialised, and most importantly, who's paid to get themselves up at the top of the search engine, which doesn't actually mean how significant they may be from a researcher's perspective. So we used DuckDuckGo, which is a non-commercial search engine. It has no optimisation of paid sites, and we installed an advertising filter as well to ensure that the results we got were as neutral as we could get them from the post-NASDAQ second generation bastardised version of the internet that those of us who are old enough to remember didn't used to be like that. So if we just break down the results at a glance. So in the end, after a very intense debate with my colleagues, we ended up with a list of 405 elements. I think at one stage we got up to about 480, and then we had to have a culling process. And also my colleagues, I generated the initial data set. It then went to two of my colleagues, not blind, but I had no influence in what they did. They then looked and decided whether my categorisations were right, and then another colleague took 10% of the sample and did that on their own. Then the people who'd done the full sample then compared to the 10% sample, and there was a 70% convergence around the classifications that I had applied to these elements. So that meant that we had a statistical variation, you know, of, I don't know, 30% or however you do it. And then we had a discussion peer-to-peer around, you know, well, is Tim right or is Tim wrong, or are you right, am I wrong? And in the end, we came to an 80% agreement, which we considered to be a consensus representation of the regime complex from our collective perspective. So if we look at those areas of activity, we came up with 60 elements that we can call agreements, 105 related to material resources, and 152 related to knowledge. I've missed off whatever the end figure here is, and I can't do maths, but anyone who's here who's very quick, you know, add these three and deduct them from that, and you'll get the number of initiatives. So I can't remember, it might be like 60 or 80 or something like that. And then in terms of the action types, and this was quite interesting, is in the end, we found that 191 of them were relating to capacity building. 66 of them were general policy concepts, and 44 were around rulemaking. But fascinatingly, when it came to actually looking at the extent to which these activities can be truly said to be around valuation, you know, valuing nature, natural capital, as we say in Australia, there were bugger all of them. 5 offset schemes, 18 biophysical valuations, 16 integrated valuations, and 19 payment schemes. So we were quite surprised about that. So we went, well, maybe we've got our categorisation of capacity building wrong. So we then, a group of us, not me, went off and then investigated that and wrote a paper about that and critically interrogated that a little bit more. But if you remember my discussion about actor network theory at the beginning, it wasn't really my role to explain, it was my role to try and represent and then allow other people to interrogate this set of results. And then again, when it comes to which actors are involved, we see 165 of them were partnerships. So perhaps there is a correlation between the fact that a lot of these actors are in partnership, and the one thing you generally can't do as a partner is agree with everybody about everything. So what you do, you chuck your money into this bucket that you call capacity building. And is this why, according to us, ecosystem services as a policy concept is stuck in capacity building? All right, what's the time, Lisa?
It's almost 11.
Okay. I'll give you a show and tell of the maps in a minute, but like, do you want to stretch or have some air or ask questions, or how are you doing? Are you alive? All right, I'm going to make you stand up. Stand up. Up we go, have a stretch. Turn around. There we go, open the window, open the door. There we go, sit down. And now we're going to have a movie, so you can go to sleep. So if we drop the blinds, will that window need to be shut, Lisa?
You want me to drop?
Well, it's just that there's a window open, so we have this policy conflict between
But we can open the door there.
oxygen. Okay. Okay, so the blinds are going down now. Get your popcorn and your Coca-Cola. So what I want to do, first of all, is use a classic international relations kind of way of how we might understand the policy nightmare that is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I use the climate regime map first as a way of taking you into the eco-regime map, which is much more conceptual and theoretical. This one is kind of more classic, where we talk about a convention, how it entered into force. We talk about the conference as a supreme body of the convention. We talk about the protocol and other instruments that get generated by the conference. The permanent subsidiary bodies whose task it is to create the policies and advice to the conference, who are assisted by a secretariat, but ultimately in the UN world everything is about finance, and once you've financed something, you need agencies to implement it, and when you implement it, you generally do so with national level activities. And because this is a conference about reporting on the impacts of climate change, there's an awful lot of reporting. So that's kind of a way that we might understand, generally speaking, the climate change regime. But we can also then undergo what we call a navigation exercise. Where we can see the different levels of activity within the climate change regime, from the convention down to reporting. But we've then also broken down the Framework Convention on Climate Change in its different thematic areas of activity, and here we've used the classic OECD colours in relation to understanding the activity areas of the climate change regime. So of course a large amount of activities in the climate change regime, particularly under the convention and the protocols, especially the Kyoto Protocol, are around mitigation of climate change activities, but also around adaptation. You may notice immediately, if I go from the blue to the orange, we can already see just in this very simple visual take that more activities in the convention appear to be around mitigation rather than adaptation. And this is a historical consequence of the fact that for the first 10 years of its life, the conference was only really focused on mitigating climate change activities, because we still somewhat naively thought that we could cure climate change. But of course that window of opportunity closed somewhere around 1975. We're too late for change. So then everybody went, oh my God, what are we going to do? Oh, we have to adapt. And it's then that we start to see an increase of activity within the convention that's looking at adapting to or coping with climate change. If we look at finance, we can see that there's a very heavy concentration of activities, particularly in terms of implementing agencies. And yes, in finance, we have put a level in called finance. But one of the reasons why we inserted this into the regime itself was because there are so many different elements that cope or look at how we finance climate action. Interestingly, when we look at capacity building, again using the Australian colloquialism, there's bugger all. There's a lot of talk about money, but there's not much talk about providing money to help people do stuff, which is a bit of a problem and always a source of contention in the negotiations themselves. But there's quite a lot of monitoring and reporting. Interestingly, I just want to draw your attention to this iteration of the map. This is post Paris Agreement. So this is after COP21 in 2015, and you can see a visual change. I think I've got the, let me get the two, I'll bring up this version which is before the Paris Agreement. So if we look at monitoring, reporting and verification before the Paris Agreement, we see that there's a lot of essentially subnational reporting activities that then send all their information back up to the conference, and there's a small role for the permanent subsidiary bodies in a range of different, whether it's the subsidiary body for implementation or SUBSTA, the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice, the two big permanent subsidiary bodies of this convention. But then when we go back and look at the post-Paris Agreement map, we suddenly see that there's a role for the Secretariat. This is a slight overemphasis visually because it's just a consequence of this particular visualization. So it looks bigger than it is. But essentially the Secretariat does at the moment have a very large role in managing reporting, particularly around the nationally determined contributions, which is the new big component of the Paris Agreement. But we can also see that there's a direct role now for the Conference of Parties as well in reporting as well. So this is a nice example of how you can use visualizations where you're aggregating lots of data of different institutions to tell a story that you might not necessarily know until you actually put the information into the spreadsheet and load it into your visualization. And then just for kind of freaking you out perspective, let's look at the elements within the regime. So I will just now scroll down the index of different institutional components within the regime. Where am I at now? I'm at E. We'll go to F. I might have to go a little bit faster. Woo! There we go. There they all are. There's an awful lot. So when we live in an age of institutional complexity and, information overload, somehow we need to be able to represent just how much there is going on in this particular policy arena. Especially when we start zooming in and looking at it in more detail. And then if we want to look in a more refined way at the way in which these different elements are nested, as we call them, one within another. So I use finance as one of these examples. So here we have the finance mechanism. So the finance mechanism really drives how climate finance gets done within the convention. And the nice thing, as you can see with this map, is you can go from the general index, and by clicking on the element or by searching the index, you get the information about that particular element, and you can see what it is directly related to within the map itself. And I'll just help interpret that.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
What does this circle actually represent? Is it the time they spent doing all this stuff?
No, this is just taking this hierarchical model. This is looking at it from the side, okay? So you can see the different levels, if you like. But then what we've done in this visualization here is take each of the individual levels and then turn it front on, so you can then see what is actually related to what. So if we go back now, so we're looking here at the finance mechanism. So the finance mechanism, if you like, is at the centre of this circle because it's kind of the most significant element that is kind of connected to everything else. This is not a time sequence here. I will show you a time sequence in the climate map. This is a general state of the regime after the Paris Agreement, and the previous one was a general visualisation before the Paris Agreement. And we've put more elements into the map in 2016 because more elements were created as a consequence of the negotiations.
Can you just say the unit? I mean, because some of the pieces are larger and smaller. Is that based on the internet?
So generally, again, no visualisation is perfect. No, what's that quote, Peter? No map is
true.
Yeah, well, what is truth? No, that quote you were talking about last night. You cannot map everything. What was it? You cannot map everything, and you cannot. We'll think about it while we're going. We had quite a few wines over dinner, I have to say, but the discussion was good. So there is a design problem here, but essentially the way this visualisation works is if you are in the middle, all these elements are nested within you. They are kind of related to you directly, not through connections, because you're a subsidiary body of something else, but over here there is a finance mechanism that's given you money. These are actually how these entities are related. So let me go back and try and help you see this. So we can see here, this is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change finance mechanism. So under the finance mechanism, we have two primary mechanisms. One is actually derived directly from the convention itself. But then we also have, and if you were to click on this, you'd get all the details. We've just put the acronyms here for shorthand. Here we have the non-United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change finance mechanisms. So within the UN Climate Change Convention, we have specific convention-related activities that talk about climate finance. But although some of the policymakers would like you to think that the Climate Change Convention is the only convention in town, there are other conventions, particularly around desertification and biodiversity, that are also generating finance and seeking finance. But there is also climate change impacting on biodiversity, and biodiversity on climate change, and desertification likewise. So within the Climate Convention, we have recognition of both the, if you like, the indigenously generated finance activities and those external to the Convention. So we can blow that up a little bit more. If we look at the non-UN activities, these are actually, largely speaking, multilateral and bilateral institutions, such as the World Bank, or this one, ICI. Oh, I wonder what that is. Let's see. Oh, the International Climate Initiative. Or, oh, what's this one? Oh, the Multi-Partner Trust Fund. So the Multi-Partner Trust Fund is a trust fund of the United Nations as a whole that has some subcomponents that relate to climate change, but also relate to other entities, but particularly in terms of the map here itself, the multi-partner trust fund runs a lot of activities in relation to UN Red, and then again we get to a level of granularity that starts to become extremely detailed. And again, we could click on all these. This is the Democratic Republic of Congo Forest something or something, and so on and so forth. But they are, yes?
Sorry, finish your sentence.
They are dealing with climate, but they actually exist in terms of the financial mechanisms themselves outside the formal United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change.
Since the bodies are not organized alphabetically in this diagram, is it their contribution that they are ordered by?
It's more the fact that they exist.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of the multi-partner trust fund, it has a UN Red trust fund, okay? And then that UN Red trust fund has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 sub-funds that dispense money in relation to Red. In terms of why are they not alphabetical, the reason is quite complicated, and it's to do with computer stuff. The way we could look at it alphabetically would be in the index, but this is, if you like, an artifact of the mapping process itself. So we have not made any categorical decision about we will go from A to Z. We've just put the elements in, and they have then organised themselves, because I would have to know what element had A at the beginning of its name when I did the original research, which of course I didn't know because I was doing the research in order to find out what elements there are. So this is not alphabetical. Yes?
Yes, to understand the approach in general, because I'm not a political researcher. So this is what you call the traditional international relations approach, right? In which you are just describing who is who and who interacts with whom. This is not looking under the bonnet yet, as you put it.
It's a kind of, in my opinion, it's a much more simplified, easy way of looking under the bonnet. When we get to looking at broader policy concepts like ecosystem services, we have to get a little more complex, as I'll show you. Yes?
Do you have a threshold of a minimum amount of dollars to put things in there, or what's the criteria? Why wouldn't lots of small foundations, for example, show up?
It depends if they're actually, as a consequence of the research, if we can identify a link to the convention and to activities within the convention, they should be in there. If they're not in there, it's my fault. But we didn't. So one thing we were interested in doing was actually putting money on each of these, which we still could do, which is one of the beauties of this. So this is, if you like, what we call a fractal design. We can just keep going and going and going, as we did with Jeff over here. I hope you're not getting too dizzy. So if we look at the Global Environment Facility, which is actually historically a product of Rio back in '92, but actually in terms of the convention has been given a formal role under the convention along with the Green Climate Fund. We've kind of done that, what you're suggesting. Because if we look at here, these are the Jeff-administered trust funds. And again, here we can see them on this slide. In direct answer to your question, the reason why there's not much private sector finance material in there is because, number one, there ain't much private sector finance when it comes to doing action on climate change under the convention. because most private sector actors that have decided to do something on climate change have already given up on the convention and are just doing it anyway. And the other reason is there just ain't that much private sector action under the convention. But in terms of, say, the Jeff administered trust funds, here we go, we could go on and on and on. So we could do a private finance version of this. And there are, of course, under the convention itself, some elements that relate to non-state action. So, for example, we have the, where is it? The NASCAR, the non-state actor zone, and different elements like that. But just to go back to this issue about we have also mapped connections in addition to this visualization over here. We've also looked at all the different elements and how they are connected to one another, if you like, across the regime. I'll also add at this point, some people are visual people and some people are not. And you probably fall into one of the two categories. I don't like, as we say in political science, pernicious dualisms, but generally speaking, it seems to me that this visualization works for some people and for others it doesn't. But I would say that for all of us, it hopefully engenders two things. First of all, we do get a sense of wonder because it is a nice shiny thing that's going round and round. But the other thing is it also makes us go, you know, bloody hell. And no wonder the climate change regime is such a mess when you look at just how much is in it. And one of the other things too it might make us think is, well, isn't it amazing that anything gets done at all? And perhaps it gives us a little sense of optimism about the fact that when we're talking about governance as the interaction between actors within institutional complexes, we start to get perhaps a slightly more positive view to global environmental governance, rather than it's just this chaos of actors fighting one with another and business interests always win. All right, well, I've talked almost for enough, but I just want to show you the eco-regime map, which was much more of a challenge to visualize because we are not dealing with a single policy arena. We're dealing with public and private actors. We're dealing with conventions and non-conventions. We're dealing with bodies that have some kind of statutory authority, but they're not really a convention. And also they're all doing different kinds of valuation type approaches, or they have a different role as an actor. So we broke this way of looking into agreements, whether they were formal or informal. The agreements engender the provision of material resources to take action on ecosystem services, largely around generating knowledge, and that knowledge then feeds into initiatives on the ground. So we still have a hierarchical view, but because ecosystem services and natural capital and the idea of valuation is less policy prescriptive and more policy descriptive, because really ecosystem services is about how do we value nature. It's much more oriented academically in terms of research. There's a lot more emphasis within ecosystem services as a whole is trying to come to grips with how we value nature. So it's more of a, what we might call an epistemic community, if that means anything to anybody here. So first of all, when we look at it, it's a lot more ugly. It's much less pretty. We can already see from the way the nested entity elements work is there is a lot of, or you might even call it fragmentation. We don't have the same degree of coherence that we saw in the climate map, from the finance mechanism to those two finance mechanisms to the sub-entities, etc., etc. In this world, we are looking much more at the connections between the activities on different levels and how they relate to these specific areas of activity. But what I might just show you, in contrast to the climate regime map, as I've already indicated in my initial show, is the striking difference between the climate map and capacity building. And in fact, if we look at the climate map and we go to capacity building, we can see there are some capacity building frameworks under the Climate Convention. We have the Paris Committee on Capacity Building, and we have the Paris Committee on Capacity Building Work Plan. But that's really, in all honesty, about it in the convention. But when we go to the eco-regime map and we put our little cursor, hover it over capacity building, we can see, well, logically agreements are less about capacity building unless they are an agreement about capacity building. But we are seeing an enormous amount of material resources in relation to putting agreements into practice around this idea. Now, this might be capacity building about a particular economic approach to valuing nature, but in and of itself, it's actually capacity building. It's not putting dollar value on a piece of land in order to buy it and save it, for example. And when we actually look at the kinds of things you would expect to see in this, we'll call it a regime. It isn't really, but we might as well. At the intergovernmental level, in the global governance field, very little material resources are being allocated to payment schemes, and quite a few initiatives, but not much knowledge generation. Again, we see a lot of discussion, not surprisingly, at the agreements level about general policy concepts, but we also see a lot of stuff on the knowledge level about general policy. And I could go on, and I would suggest that you explore this map yourself, but I just want to conclude with an what we call an analytics view. I'll let that run there for a minute, but I just quickly want to go back and show you something quite interesting in the eco-regime map in relation to the role that research plays within formulating this regime. So if you remember that originally we used the terms ecosystem services and natural capital as combined with value or valuation or assessment with our neutral search engine. So this is quite interesting. And I mean, I suppose in a sense it's something that once again you Europeans can be proud of, is the extent to which you have contributed to this regime. If we look at the rise of the use of the term either natural capital or ecosystem services within the historical European Union research framework programs, the EUFP, a significant European research approach which started in the early 1970s and continues now, but because we love to call things like, what is it, 2020 vision, or, you know, we've moved away from using solid acronyms now. But if we look, for example, at the EU third framework programme for community activities, we can see in this visualisation this is the framework programme itself up here. When you get home you can zoom in and do it more yourself. But you can see there are 3 strands coming in. One strand is a research funding around capacity building. It's all named and stuff in the map. One is about integrated assessment and one is about economic valuation. So we have 3 projects in EU FP3 on ecosystem services as we might understand it generally. By the time we go to EU FP7, which is about what, I can't remember now, 2010 or 12 or something, it's in there. We see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33 EU-funded research activities specifically in relation to ecosystem services. So we can already tell, the European Union is having a significant impact on forming this regime. And then just in conclusion, this relates to the question I think the gentleman at the front asked about looking at the concept over time. So when I put the data together for this map, we started in about 1895, which was the first element that later engendered ecosystem services activities. So I think our first element is 1895. And I think the last funded program that we put in finishes in 2030. So that's the kind of gap that we're looking at. But really, for argument's sake, let's enter the year 1990. Let's enter the year, for argument's sake, 1998, because that's a long way after Rio, but still obviously influenced by Rio. And let's put in, for argument's sake, 2018. And if the analytics gods are kind to me, which they have been, they will show me what's hot and what's not. So here we see, once again, good old capacity building, scooting up over those years. Here we see rule making also increasing. Also our general policy concepts are increasing, but our actual valuation activities are still pretty pathetic and still fairly static. But we can also see in pure numbers terms, so if we look at agreements that have the term ecosystem services or similar in them, in the 1990 we've got 17, by 98 we've got 32, by 218 we've got 58, and we have a total of 60 items, 94 items and 236 items altogether. And then if we scroll down to the bottom, we get those themes and types in aggregate. So in 90 we have 44 elements in relation to capacity building. We have 21 intergovernmental organisations and 18 scientific organisations. So in 1990 we can generally say the kind of actors who are really pushing this concept are science and intergovernmental organisations. And they're still largely around capacity building. But when we go to 2018, in that particular year, so remember this is an instance, this isn't a synthesis view of the whole regime, this is taking a slice in time, we see that there are 70 intergovernmental organisations, but overtaking them now, we have 73 partnerships active in this policy space. But we're still seeing capacity building as being predominant with policy concept and rulemaking rather than actual types of valuation being predominant. And then just quickly to show you what we call the back end of how we actually build this map. So each one of these is this goes back to the thing about why aren't they all alphabetical. We've got all the activities listed here. And then if we go in, so this is where you build an entry. So this is just the back-end visualization. So this is actually probably more useful for those of you who might be interested in adopting this tool or this approach and building and constructing your own regimes in collaboration with me, because I love this stuff. Oh, that's not so good on the connections front. But, so from an editing perspective, this is where you enter all your text. This is where you classify the theme. This is where you enter your information. So what's interesting about this map building, particularly with the climate regime map, in April 2018, UNFCCC.int went from being a static website with an HTTP address to an HTTPS address in order for to securitize it more, because we live in an age of securitization. And of course, the web-based platform that delivers the most secure websites is this thing called WordPress. And WordPress is a phage. I don't know if any of you are biologists here, but a phage is a pernicious disease that gobbles up everything and takes control. The UNFCCC.int site is now dead, and it's a WordPress site, and all the entries, or something like 40% of the entries in the climate map, no longer exist on that website. So it's had the equivalent of an atom bomb dropped on it. And the only place now where that data actually exists is in the map, which is quite scary when we think that the UN Climate Change Convention is probably the most important thing that's going on in the world right now. That's a bit of an aside and somewhat bombastic. But here you put your data in. This is where, at that instance, in 1992, when this element was created, the day that it died, because many things, not everything is eternal in the UN system, apart from the subcommittees in the Climate Change Convention, because everybody gets sitting fees and a nice resource allowance when they get to New York. This is where you put the day something's created and the day something dies. And then the other kind of cool thing, if you like things like that, is behind every year of data, in addition to the synthesis view, so as I said, there is what we call the synthesis view, which has everything. There is a spreadsheet. So if you want to adopt this technology and become a friend of Tim, you can export this data, and then you can go away and play with this data however you want to. And then finally, just to give you the perspective in aggregate, if the analytics gods are kind to me. Of course, there's no thematic summary because we're looking at an aggregate view. Just to show you across the life of this policy concept, we see 60 agreements, 105 elements providing material resources, 152 generating knowledge, and 88 initiatives. And again, here we have the statistics as a whole. And that, my friends, is that. Okay, so right at the end of the show, I showed you what's called the back end. So we have inside the back end built a tool for connecting elements, and then we have 4 categorizations of connection. We have what we call a general connection. So that's just general connection. Under negotiation. And then we have what we call an interactive relationship and what we call a consequential relationship. So the next map, each of the lines that you can see there will be a different, either with dots or stripes, and you'll be able to see whether this element on this level is a consequence of this, or whether it's a general connection because it's part of the same intergovernmental platform, or if it's consequential because it's being funded, for example. So yes, we can and we have. But each one of these particular tools to build costs somewhere between 10 and 20,000 euros. So, I mean, you're looking at the climate map, which cost 33,000 euro, which was a bargain. I'm adding on these features every time I get funding. So I've just got the shell now to build the what we're calling the forest regime map. So that's a map that's about to be built. So if any of you are specifically interested in forests, I would love your input. Also, if you're interested in ecosystem services, I would ask you to please go in there and tear this thing to pieces. Find if you're in there, and if you're not, let me know why.
Yes, thanks also for the nice and interesting presentation. I had a question regarding the eco-regime map. Is it possible if you could go back to it? When you were talking about, when you tipped on the payments for ecosystem services regime, is it?
Yeah.
Is it correct to call it like that. Anyways, you showed that there were some initiatives being implemented, but that there was a very low amount of knowledge generated on this hierarchical approach. So I'm just wondering whether that means, or I can conclude that there's some level of implementation without any knowledge on, that's the kind of information I could get out of the map as well.
Yes, so look, he's just a totally random click that this is on. This is the British American Tobacco Biodiversity Partnership. Okay, so we can see that it's connected to this element here, FFI. Now I happen to know that FFI is Flora and Fauna International because I put the data into the map. But this is an actor that has been funded to be involved in this activity. Some knowledge that's generated in the map just stops and doesn't flow down to initiatives, but some does. So for example, one element that's well worth kind of chasing down in this map is the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. So the Cambridge Conservation Initiative has generated a large number of research activities. So we can see that the Cambridge Conservation Initiative has developed some general policy concepts around biodiversity and climate change. We can also see that the Cambridge Conservation Initiative has engendered a collaborative fund for conservation. We can also see a whole range of activities that this particular element within the map has proliferated throughout the system. So we can trace the connections, but we can also see where things just stop dead. And don't go from knowledge to action as well. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes.
At the beginning of your presentation, you talked about USA bringing 300 experts and 2 are the only ones, so we can understand that USA will be much more influential on climate policy. If you apply the same logic to these figures, this is now we should see the inventory of different organizations, but we really don't know, or agreements, we really don't know which is more important, which is having higher impact. Am I interpreting this correctly, or we can still understand that we can still get the information that what is the more important agreement, who is having more influence, or is it the next stage of your work?
So, your profile as a user, that's your interest, okay? So you could do some initial data mining from the map, either by requesting the spreadsheet and putting in the search US or America or whatever, and then generating your own results from the spreadsheet. You would be able to see how many of the elements within the map have some kind of US connection, or you could look at the agreements and see which agreements are connected to other elements in the map. You could do that. As a tool as it exists at the moment, that's not what's there, because, as I say, we're trying to not do all things for all people, but just create something that engenders these kinds of questions. But on a general level, you could look at the nested view, and you can go to the pieces of pie, it's kind of a little bit counterintuitive, because there's a particular visual representation problem with this, but essentially the smaller the elements go, the more entities there are to the parent. So if we look at this particular parent, we can see that it's engendered all these children, and all these children this element has grandchildren that stack back to this element that go back to this element. So we can see already the UN is quite significant. Well, duh, yeah. But this is also reflected by the different elements, whether they're agreements or bodies that are being engendered by this particular piece of data entry. Again, the EU, here we have the NCD, the Natural Capital Declaration. Again, it's engendered a few. ITTO, not really, so this is a visual problem here. The ITTO looks big, but it's not actually big. It's really looking at the number of kids that come off these elements that's really going to tell you the significance. So you might want to then concentrate your research on these particular elements. And again, you might want to do that not at that level, but on the knowledge level. And again, you know, here we can see with the various EU, again, here are all the EU framework program activities, and not surprisingly, most of them are based around knowledge generation. But if you were to do a little bit more digging with the map, you would find a few of the EU framework program elements of their actual initiatives on the ground.
Two questions. Are you institutionally going to maintain this system and keep it updated? Because the value of it obviously decreases with it's a static thing, and now the project is over. How are you going to institutionalize it? That was one. And the other one was, do you have any sense of who's using your system? Do you monitor who goes on your website and clicks on? Do you have a sense of the demand for this?
Okay, so in relation to the first question, at least with Eco-Regime Map, we have a snapshot in time for about 50 years.
Right.
So those elements won't change. So for historical value, as an archive, it's there. If you're interested in collaborating and providing fund for a secretariat and a steering committee to advise on the creation of new elements and iterations, I would volunteer my time for you for nothing. In relation to who uses it, unfortunately this very terrible second, so we've had these ghastly kinds of atomic, we've had weaponized, the internet has become weaponized, not just in terms of how we use social media, but in terms of what gets advertised and what gets promoted. So before the abolition of net neutrality in the US and the collapse of a diverse ecosystem in the largest search engine traffic in the world, now everything's more or less controlled by Verizon. So Verizon determines what comes up on the search engines. I can't tell you. A bit like the impact of WordPress on the historical architecture and archaeology of the internet. It's had this devastating impact. But what I can tell you is that before net neutrality in the US was abolished, when we launched this map at the Global Landscapes Forum at Paris on Forest Day, within 48 hours we had 2,800 visits, and the average visit, check this out, was 1 minute and 6 seconds. Not 2 seconds. So these are some people who are probably staying there for 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes. And one of them, because there's a little button there, I don't know if you see, it says give feedback. One was this entity called NOAA. the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, a scientist, a climate scientist, who wrote back and said, hooray, for the first time somebody has done something with this regime that we have needed for years. And so to get that kind of feedback from NOAA was really nice. But the other thing that we have done, not so much with the eco-regime map because it's kind of pretty theoretical and research oriented, the map was constructed in collaboration with I think about 45 actors within the Climate Convention, so people on subsidiary bodies, NGOs. I took various iterations of the map, and interestingly, what they do, all of the people, the policymakers, when I show them the climate map, they go, oh, well, where am I? Oh, there I am. Oh, am I related to that? I never knew that. I thought I was related to that. And of course, one of the reasons why these kind of visualization tools are so important in these conventions is because negotiators basically have, unless they're an elephant or a whale, they have a life expectancy in the climate convention of about 3 years. They come in as a wide-eyed, enthusiastic party delegate. They don't know what the hell is going on. They spend their first climate convention just running around the different venues. They get a little bit settled down by the second convention. By the third conference, they're starting to have a substantive influence on text, and then they're gone. So we actually need visualization tools like this for policymakers and negotiators and informed, stakeholders as well as the general public. The general public need to be, as you were, and my apologies, educated into how this visualization works, but once people see it and get it, they do tend to use it as far as we can tell. But we don't pay, we're not paying for any advertising for this.
Any other questions?
Well, I must say that I'm among those who only went for 1 year to this convention. So I totally understand the usefulness of such a tool. Another question I had was, what do you expect in terms of the practical use of such a tool? For instance, could we understand or try to establish relationships between either the number of kids, as you put it, or the type of father or mother involved in terms of what we actually achieve in terms of sustainability, in terms of the goals of each particular agreement and so on?
The short answer is yes. The medium answer is not at the moment because we don't have the research capacity to do that. The long answer is yes, we can, but we need to do a lot more research, and I could tell you how we would go about doing that. But the answer is yes, because now under, for example, the Green Climate Fund, there is an expectation under your NDC contribution that when you put in your funding application, you have to be able to both say the impact that you're going to have, and then you actually have to report on it. So we can build reporting actions on the ground into this, and we could have another analytics button that would press and it would give you the results in actual carbon if we wanted to do that. But at the moment, we're constrained by the fact that in the eco-regime map, for example, there are actually 450 roughly of 500 different data lines, and each line is 10 columns, so there are over 4,500 individual sets of data of entries that have gone into that map. So I need a couple of research assistants and and a nice EU framework programme funding initiative for 5 to 7 years to employ you all.
Thanks, Timothy, for the great presentation. I have a question regarding the beginning of the presentation and how the map then came about, or rather, you showed in the beginning a table of indicators for governance and democracy, quality, some might even say capacity, policy mix, all those words. How do those, like, what is productive problem solving or durability in terms of a policy initiative? So does your map already tell me that it's productive, or have you rated that already?
Okay, so in the climate map, there is also, you may have seen here, take a survey. So in the original iteration of the map, each one of these elements, you could click on it and it took you to SurveyMonkey, and then you could make a decision using the 11 indicators as to how you wanted to rate the quality of governance of that entity. So we did it, and we did some experimental results visualisation. So the answer is yes, we can, but again, it's a capacity issue. But in terms of your general question, we haven't pursued that particularly far, but I have done that in my other work. And the alarming finding wherever we go is that we tend to get similar results. But also, I'm not saying what is the problem or what is the behaviour change. The respondents themselves, I'm a great believer in the stakeholder knows what they're talking about. So actually what you do is ask the stakeholder, what do you think? And then in my other work outside this space, I actually spend a lot of time working with stakeholders building what we call quality of governance standards. So I've been active in Nepal for 10 years now, working on emissions reduction and deforestation, and we've built a standard around what the stakeholders consider to be a durability of emissions reduction activities. And they will tell us what durability means. And one of the most important indicators of durability for global stakeholders, and it actually doesn't matter what level you're talking, they all say, yeah, the money comes, we get really excited, and we put this thing in place, and then the money stops, and nothing happens. So, I mean, already we know that if we want durability of climate action or deforestation action, we actually have to continue to provide the participants and the stakeholders in these initiatives with the resources to continue. In Nepal, with RED, what the stakeholders themselves at the community level did, we're going to have a durability issue. And interestingly, because we were there asking them what's durability, we were in this interactive relationship with them. And they went, we'll take the RED money and we'll put it in our community forest fund, and we will not let our members use the principal but only the interest to do stuff in the community. So the RED money that went to some clever community forest people in Nepal is still being used to generate emissions reduction activities because they've worked out how to keep it going. So they knew what durability meant in terms of funding and how to continue sustainability. Again, stakeholders very often have the solution to the problem at hand.
I think that stage would be a really interesting one.